All right, welcome back to ABA exam review in our latest RBT practice exam series, where we're going through the next set of questions together and breaking them down. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. Please like and subscribe. Check out btexamreview.com for all of our study materials. As always, when you pass, please let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. Let's get going. A cold front came through your city and now it's below freezing. You decide to pick up soup for dinner from your local deli. Cold front functions as a blank relative to getting soup for dinner. When dealing with behavior questions or contingency questions, such as SDs and consequences, we always want to identify what behavior or what event we're looking at. In this case, we're looking at the cold front relative to getting soup for dinner. Essentially, the question is asking you, how does the cold front affect you getting soup for dinner? Well, we know the cold front came through your city, and so you decide to pick up soup. So the question you have to ask yourself to distinguish between an MO or an SD is, was the consequence available before this thing happened? In other words, could you have picked up soup at any point before the cold front? Sure, soup theoretically was always available. You could have always gone pick up soup for dinner. Only when the cold front came through did you decide to go pick up soup. Meaning, what happened? Meaning, when the cold front came through, the value of the soup increased. So when something happens, which increases the value of a reinforcer or a consequence, we consider that a motivating operation. Remember, a motivating operation makes you want or not want, and SD says something is available. Again, the soup was always available. You could have gone get soup for dinner at any point, but only when the cold front came through did the value of that soup increase and make you decide to go pick up that soup for dinner. So the cold front functions as a motivating operation. It isn't a prompt because it comes before our response, and it isn't a consequence because the consequence would follow the response. Your supervising behavior analyst explains to you that your new client is prone to making errors when learning a skill. The supervisor tells you to use a most to least prompting procedure. Where would you start? Where would you start on a most to least prompting procedure? You need to identify, of course, what a most to least prompting procedure is. This is when we use the most invasive prompt at the beginning of our intervention. Usually this involves errorless learning. If we're going to use most to least prompting procedure, we're preventing errors from happening because errors lead to more errors. And we know that this client is already prone to making errors. Therefore, the supervisor wants you to use a most to least prompting procedure. So if you're going to start with a most to least prompting procedure, you need the most invasive prompt possible. So A, allow the client to attempt the skill first without providing a prompt. In that case, you would be using a least to most. If you allow the client an attempt without using a prompt, that is least to most prompting. No prompt is the least amount of prompt you can give. B, model the skill for the learner. Well, modeling is intrusive, but it isn't as intrusive or invasive as a physical prompt. So it's not quite at the top of the hierarchy. C, use graduated guidance to help the learner complete the skill. You're getting closer because graduated guidance is a physical prompt, a type of physical prompting, but it's a physical prompting that you fade very rapidly and you only use as necessary. If we look at D, use a hand-over-hand prompt to help the client engage in the response. Now we're talking, right? Because a hand-over-hand prompt is this full physical prompt where you're literally doing the behavior for the client and preventing all errors. It is an errorless learning strategy, hand-over-hand prompting. So hand-over-hand prompting will be by far the most intrusive prompt. So if you're going to start with most to least prompting, you would use D, a hand-over-hand prompt, to help the client engage in the response. Joan had a big job interview last week. The interview was for her dream job as a Disney World princess. Joan is checking her email every hour, but still hasn't received anything from Disney. Joan's behavior represents what type of reinforcement schedule? So be careful here. What's the question asking about? They're asking about Joan's behavior, not about what type of schedule Disney is on. They're talking about Joan. So we know Joan is checking her email every hour. So every hour she's engaging in a response. So if she's engaging in a response every hour on the hour, we know it's one, fixed, right? Because it's not changing. and it's time-based. Hour passes, engages in a response. Hour passes, engages in a response. So it's a fixed amount of time. Is that a fixed ratio? No, a fixed ratio is a fixed amount of responses. It would be a fixed interval, a fixed amount of time. Variable ratio would be an average amount of responses, and a variable interval would be an average amount of time. Now, this question is a little confusing because a reinforcement schedule implies she's getting reinforcement, and she's not. But you've got to just kind of analyze it a little bit and think about, all right, assume she was getting reinforcement and she's on the schedule. If she's on a schedule where every hour on the hour she engages in a response, well, she's on some sort of interval schedule, because on an interval schedule, you get reinforced for every response following the amount of time. So after every hour she responds, theoretically would get reinforcement. Obviously not, but based on the information, the best answer here is going to be a fixed interval schedule. A client often screams at the top of their lungs. The function is not obvious at this time. The RBT is taking partial interval data on screaming and set the interval at 15 seconds. The client screams right at 15 seconds, 3 intervals in a row. How many responses should the RBT record? What you should start getting good at on the RBT exam and practicing is when they give you really, really specific vocabulary words, is immediately identifying those and starting to predict the answer. We know we're using partial interval data, right? So already in our mind, we should be thinking, what is partial interval recording? Partial interval recording, we set an amount of time, we set a number of intervals. If the behavior occurs at all during the interval, we record a response. We know, right, the interval's 15 seconds, okay? The client screams right at 15 seconds 3 times in a row. So we have 3 intervals, okay, of 15 seconds, and the client screamed at 15 seconds each time. Well, how many responses does the RBT record? Now we know with partial interval, again, if the client engages at all in the behavior, it's going to count. So 15 seconds, I scream. 15 seconds, I scream. 15 seconds, I scream. 3 times in a row. I've done the behavior 3 times in a row, 3 different intervals. How many responses? Well, not 0, because they're engaged. It isn't going to be 1 or 2. It's got to be 3. There are 3 intervals. They've engaged in the behavior all 3 intervals. So knowing partial interval data, each interval you would record a response for. So since you have 3 intervals, you need 3 total responses. Dave's dad shows him a band called ZZ Top. The members of the band have huge white beards. Now, whenever Dave sees a man with a big beard, he says ZZ Top. This is an example of what? All right, if you've been studying, you probably could predict the answer to this question. We know that Dave's dad showed him a band called ZZ Top, and they all have huge white beards. Okay, that's kind of a giveaway. So now whenever Dave sees a man with a big beard, he says ZZ Top. So not only do the band members does Dave refer to as ZZ Top, but the guy at Target, the guy walking down the street, he's got all these different stimuli, and he's using the same response across all these stimuli. So when you have multiple stimuli in a single response, what do we call that? A response generalization. Well, response generalization is the opposite, right? You have a single stimulus with multiple responses. Here, our response is ZZ Top, and Dave is engaged in that same response across multiple stimuli. So it's going to be an example of stimulus generalization. It's not maintenance because Dave isn't maintaining this behavior of calling the band ZZ Top, right? He's now generalized to these other people, okay? All we need is Dave to be able to continue calling the band ZZ Top, ZZ Top. However, not other men with big beards. He shouldn't be saying that to them. What's happening is Dave is generalizing across stimuli. It's stimulus generalization. As a team, a supervisor and 2 technicians decide that escape from a task is the most reinforcing thing for their client. What type of chaining would you recommend? It's kind of a technical question, all right? What type of chaining uses escape as reinforcement? Well, think about forward chaining. With forward chaining, what do? We teach that first step. So they're reinforced after the first step. and yet you still need to prompt them and complete all the other steps. So they're not done once they're complete the first step. With backwards chaining, when they complete the step we're teaching, which is the last step, they're done. Escape is functioning and is used as reinforcement for completing that last step. With total task chaining, where you're teaching all the steps, or the steps all at a time, usually when there's only 1 or 2 steps they don't know. And then a behavior chain interruption strategy is going to be the hardest because you're going to change up the chain. You're going to break the chain. So if you know you have a client or a learner, right, that escape is their most reinforcing thing, are you going to use forward chaining or backwards chaining? Because you're not going to use total task chaining. You're teaching the whole chain. You're not going to use behavior chain interruption strategy because to use that, they already need to know the chain. If escape is most reinforcing, well, try backwards chaining because you teach the last step and their reinforcement is escape. So it's going to be an extremely reinforcing thing to complete the chain. So what type of chaining would you recommend if your client's biggest reinforcer was escape? Well, backwards chaining. George decides he will start doing the opposite of everything he normally does. He then gets a raise and gets a date. He continues doing the opposite of everything he would normally do. What changed George's behavior? Yeah, how did George's behavior change? Did it increase? Did it decrease? Well, it increased, right? He said, I'm going to do the opposite of everything I do. And then he continued doing the opposite of everything he would normally do. So his behavior maintained or increased. Now, what changed that? Well, as a result, as a consequence, he gets a raise, he gets a date. So getting a raise and getting a date function as what? Well, we're adding the raise, right? We're adding the date to the positive, and they're increasing George's behavior, reinforcement. A, positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement would imply something was removed as a result of George doing the opposite, which isn't the case. And then punishment, C and D, would imply George's behavior decreased, which of course isn't the case. George's behavior was changed due to positive reinforcement. A 6th grade teacher requires students who earn D's and F's on exams to take their exams home and have their parents sign their exams. The teacher wants to make sure the parents know how the kids are performing. How is the teacher measuring this? How can the teacher possibly measure knowing that the parents know how the kids are performing? She's not at home with them. She's not videotaping them. She doesn't see any of these things. Well, her way of doing that is getting the students who earn D's and F's to take their exams home and have their parents sign their exams. So when they sign them, they bring them back to the teacher. She can look at the signature and say, okay, you showed your parents you got a D or an F. Now, what kind of measurement is this? Well, we know she isn't directly observing them. You have to keep that in mind. So it's not going to be rate. We're not taking frequency for 1. There's no time for 2. And for 3, she's not directly observing. It's not latency. She's not measuring the time in between an ESD and response. And she's not directly observing. And it can't be inter-response time because, again, she's not measuring the time in between 2 responses and she's not directly observing. It has to be permanent product. One of the advantages of permanent product is you don't have to directly observe the behavior. You're only observing the product or the outcome. The product or the outcome in this case is the parents signing the exams. Once those parents sign those exams, okay, she can measure that permanent product data. Those signatures on the exams are the permanent product data she's using to measure the fact that the parents know how the kids are performing. And then finally, ethically, are you allowed to be friends with your supervising behavior analyst? Now, we have all kind of rules in place about dating clients and stakeholders and supervisors and professional relationships, personal relationships, all these great things, right? However, ethically, the question asks, are you allowed to be friends with your supervising behavior analyst? I mean, if you're an RBT, there's a good chance you're friends with at least one of your supervisors, or at least I hope you are. You should have a good relationship with them, okay? And the ethical code doesn't say anything about friendships and friendships with your analyst, all right? So A, no, you cannot have any type of relationship with your supervisor. That's just not true, okay? They're specific about some relationships, but the fact you can't have any is just not true. B, yes, but you cannot date your supervisor. Now that is correct. You can be friends with your supervising behavior analyst, but you can't date them. Now, what do we mean by you can't date them? We mean if you do want to date them, what do you have to do? You've got to terminate that supervision relationship and that contract. C, yes, and you can date your supervisor. You can't date your supervisor. C is wrong. And then D, you must disclose all friendships with the BACB. No, you don't need to disclose all your friendships with the BACB. They don't really care. They ethically don't care if you're friends with your supervising behavior analyst. They do care if you're dating them, and they do care if it's exploitative. But if you're just friends, not a big deal. So, ethically, are you allowed? Yes, but you cannot date your supervisor. Great. Check out btexamreview.com. All of our study materials. Let us know when you pass. As always, work hard, study hard. See you soon.